discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink.
And today, we will be continuing our series Lo-Fi Sci-Fi with 1982's Liquid Sky.
You wanted to know who and what I am? I'm a killer. You wanted to know where I'm from? I'm from Connecticut. Mayflower Stone. I was taught that my prince would come, and he would be a lawyer, and I would have his children. And on the weekends we would barbecue. And all the other princes and their princesses would come. And they would say, delicious, delicious. Oh, how boring.
So here we are, Liquid Sky, a 1982 independent film directed by Slava Zuckerman, starring Anne Carlisle. Liquid Sky follows a young model in early 1980s New York named Margaret, and another model named Jimmy, both played by Anne Carlisle. And it kind of crosses over into sci-fi here when a UFO lands on the roof of the penthouse apartment occupied by Margaret and her roommate Adrian. And as we go along here, we see Margaret kind of struggling to work through her life as a model, and this strange thing starts happening where every time she has sex with someone, they kind of, for lack of a better term, liquidate. They just kind of disappear into thin air, and when she discovers that she has this power, she starts to use it to avenge past demons that we see earlier on in the film. Yes. Which, that's a pretty loose interpretation. This plot jumps all over the place. This isn't necessarily a film that I think, as many of the films we discuss, plot is that important. Once again, we're dealing with a really low budget here of $500,000, so comparatively low. Once again, our last episode we talked about THX, and that budget was just over $700,000. This one, once again, we're looking around $500,000. Mm-hmm. So, not a huge budget, not super, super small either, but I think used really, really well.
Yes. I agree. I think the fact that they didn't have that much money, it allowed them to be much more creative with how they told their story, and the character. They concentrated more on the characters, I found, which was the most interesting aspect of it. The main actress, as you mentioned, who actually has a dual role in it, the actress Anne Carlisle, as both a man and a woman. Although they're both pretty androgynous, but Margaret and Jimmy. So they were able to focus more on, actors, characters, the sets, and obviously the most important aspect of this film, I think, the makeup.
Makeup, yeah. And this was an interesting time because they actually mentioned David Bowie by name in this film.
They do.
But this was kind of when, that androgynous, highly stylized thing, that modeling thing was very, very popular. And it was kind of in a way where a lot of people were doing it, where it was this underground movement, but it was kind of crossing over into the mainstream a little bit. It was something that people were familiar with. And one of the things that I found really interesting about this film, and I do think, just to preface this, I really enjoyed this film.
I did as well.
I know, Mark, you were saying you did. And what I really enjoyed about it is that it could have really easily ended up just being an exercise in style. Mm-hmm. It's a totally stunningly beautiful film. Mark and I were talking before recording this. We actually saw two different. So there aren't two versions. There's only one version of this film. But
George Lucas here.
No George Lucas here. But there is a restored print, which Mark saw. I saw an unrestored print, and both. I've seen clips from the restored print, and it's stunning. It's absolutely beautiful. These colors are just so rich. But even the one I saw, which was kind of a pretty rough print, for lack of a better term, it was still really beautiful. The colors are rich. The characters' hairstyles are beautiful. The makeup is stunning. The camera work is really nice. There's some excellent abstractions, but all to support bigger ideas and character development.
Yeah, so the characters. Well, let's talk about the makeup real quick because I do want to focus on that since it is such a main focus of the film. The way I saw it is makeup is almost another character in the film,
Hmm.
and you mentioned the color as well, which I feel like the whole movie feels almost neon or
Yeah,
like Christmas lights. You know, it just
very.
there's those strange tones are just over everything
It
in
could
this
it could have
movie.
been a Nick Winding Refn movie
Yeah,
easily,
yeah. I mean, I feel like I don't know if he was influenced by this, but
but
it
wouldn't be
definitely has that.
surprised.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a surprise exactly. Yeah, so just the colors and the makeup, uh, almost their own character in the film, and they get a lot of screen time. They get like a spotlight put on them, and I think justifiably so because I think that aspect goes along with the theme of the film. Where the main character almost feels like an empty shell,
Hmm.
and she's doing herself up and going on photo shoots, but clearly, she doesn't feel all that exotic or, all that interesting. She kind of just, it's almost like she's just going with emotions. She's in New York at that time. She's in a
Hmm.
certain scene and she's just with a certain group of people. And obviously there's drugs involved. And she's kind of just going along with it.
Lots of drugs.
So lots of drugs, lots of drugs. So yeah, the makeup and the colors and all of that, the sets, they all kind of go along with that. I think that's why, and like you said, Jeremy, I think the film is a lot deeper than even I thought it was going to be.
Hmm.
So I had seen this film before, but it definitely I would say it kind of washed over me, and I don't know if that's my fault or what. I probably maybe wasn't giving it my full attention at the time, but this time when I watched it definitely resonated a lot more with me. I guess I was probably paying attention more to it, and I got a lot from it, and I thought there was a lot of interesting ideas there. The dialogue was great. It was very like, snappy but poignant, and interesting. A lot of great quotes from it.
Not all of which we can say, or
No,
if we do say, will be. So this is definitely the focus of this movie. A large chunk of it is this young woman having this kind of sexual reckoning. There are a lot of people in her life, both men and women, who are forcing themselves on her, and she's kind of this object of lust and beauty. And this idea of objectification, and it was done, at least in a way I haven't seen it done before, where it wasn't so much that, you know, it wasn't so much that she was presented as a sexual object. It was just that you understood that that's what she was. She was in
yeah,
makeup, she was getting dolled up, and it was just kind of because that's what other people were telling her to do. There was this big monologue close to the end, which once again, spoilers on the show always. There's
always.
this big, really beautiful monologue at the end where she goes on about how she was from Connecticut and she was told that she would find a husband and they would have barbecues, but then she was told that she should be a free woman and she should move to New York. But then when she got to New York, she was told that if she wanted to be free, she had to be a model and wear makeup. And you realize that regardless of the circle she in, even regardless of the circle she in, even if she feels like this liberated woman because she's rebelling, she still feels trapped because she's still just trying to connect. So the makeup serves a really interesting purpose because generally when you see these kind of avant-garde films, they're rebellious by putting the makeup on, but in this particular film, her putting the makeup on is oppressive, which was really subversive. I don't know if I've seen
Hmm.
that before.
Yeah. And in this era of Me Too and that movement, I felt like it resonated with that as
Mm-hmm.
well, because she is essentially abused by a lot of these clients or just men that she comes across, and she's almost dead to the world. In those moments, where it's weird because she's a very complex character. She's very liberated and in control, but also at the same time she gives herself over to these sexual predators essentially.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a weird sort of empowerment behind it, and it seems like she's struggling with that throughout the entire film.
Mm-hmm.
Did you get that as well from her?
Yeah, well, I think she's kind of caught in this uncomfortable situation where she doesn't really know who she is or who she wants to be, and she because of that, she doesn't really seem to love herself. She doesn't really seem to love herself. She doesn't really seem to be particularly passionate about anything, and because of that, I think that when horribly devastating things are happening to her, she doesn't feel like she's in a position where she can react in any way. She doesn't feel like she can say anything about it, which is, really common now. I
Yeah.
mean, we're learning way more about it now because people are, thank God, finally being vocal. But
Coming
she doesn't
forward.
really, yeah, but she doesn't feel like she can come out and say anything about it, so she kind of internalizes it. So then to get to our sci-fi aspect, because a lot of you are probably sitting around saying, well, how is this a sci-fi movie?
Yeah.
Like we mentioned before, this UFO lands on the penthouse of her apartment. It's a little confusing. This is where it gets a little difficult to follow, but these aliens are in search of some kind of chemical that's released by the human brain that is similar to that of heroin, is similar to that of
it's
opiate
like
receptors.
it's like endorphins, right? For
Yeah, like endorphins that only gets released when people have sex and orgasm.
orgasm. Yeah.
So when she starts having, so when she has sex with people and they orgasm, they're killed immediately, and presumably that endorphin is sucked from their brain by the aliens. Pretty wacky, but stay with us here
Yeah.
because it's all a metaphor.
It's all a metaphor. Yeah.
And the whole thing is that she's not able to orgasm because she's kind of empty, so she's not dying each time she has sex. She's kind of left alone, which is really, it's an interesting metaphor. Also, just about the pursuit of pleasure, which a lot of this film is about. There's one part where the title comes from, Liquid Sky, is a drug dealer is talking and he's saying we're all chasing that liquid sky, we're all chasing that pleasure. That's not verbatim. Maybe we can pull up a clip and play it here. But everyone in this film seems to be chasing a constant high. Everyone is, they'll be in the middle of setting up for a photo shoot and all they can think about is drugs, which was really prevalent in this scene and all came crashing down with the AIDS epidemic a few years later.
Yeah.
But this idea of chasing the high, and everyone's chasing the high, and she's spent her whole life chasing the high and is having this awakening where she realizes that the high doesn't really lie in anything that anyone else will tell her to do. It has to come from herself.
Yeah, and that's something that you don't really know until later in the film. You don't really learn that until later. What exactly is going on, because it is hard to tell when you're watching the movie. Focusing on that sci-fi aspect, we should talk about that a little bit. So I for one thought the notion of invisible aliens, that's certainly one way to get around not having a budget, or having a
that's
very
brilliant. Yeah,
having a very small budget. I think that's a kind of like I thought the same exact thing. I thought it was brilliant. Because it is a sci-fi film, it can be classified as one, but it's also something completely different, and it's so much more than that, and it's very artistic and avant-garde, and the fact that they use these invisible aliens as a metaphor, I thought was really smart.
Yeah.
You do see UFOs,
Yeah.
but
Briefly though, it's not overdone.
Yeah, they don't focus on it very much. So it is such an abstract concept in the film that there's these aliens, because you have characters that do talk about the aliens and the UFOs, but it's really not the main focus. So the main focus is this main character and just the scene at that time. I mean, we talked a little bit before we recorded that New York at this time, the pre-2000 New York, before it was quote unquote cleaned up, whatever you want to call it.
Disneyland.
Exactly. Yeah. Before that, it was a completely different scene there, completely different city. So you see that on display in this film, and it's one of the more interesting aspects of it, I would say.
And so this did, just for a little background, this came out of a movement, or at least in my research I found that it came out of a movement called No Wave, which was a play on New Wave, which was a group of artists including Jim Jarmusch, famous for Stranger Than Paradise, Down by Law. One of my personal favorites, Mystery Train.
Here.
Yeah, Mystery Train. I love tons of great Jim Jarmusch, but also some really great visual artists, such as Robert Longo and Richard Prince. Also
Andy Warhol was in there too, I felt.
Yeah, Andy Warhol. I think Andy Warhol was a little
different scene.
But he was kind of involved. He was,
his influence was there.
His influence was huge.
The Factory, yeah.
Also, like Madonna was coming up in the city at this time. The synth bass, this is a fun fact, just because the song has been stuck in my head for 2 months. The synth bass that they use to score this is 100% the same synth bass sample or whatever that's in Like a Virgin.
Is it really?
100%. I have no doubt in my mind it's the same thing.
That's great.
So this is really of that time.
And like you said, they mentioned David Bowie. Like, they knew what they were doing
Yeah,
with this.
there was an awareness with this film, and an artful quality. And what was interesting with this no wave movement is that it was kind of the '80s version of like DIY. You know, you would see a lot of these films come out, and a lot of them were shot on 8 or 16 millimeter, handheld, made with their friends. No one even would think of using a permit uh, or anything like that, which is something that is going to be very common throughout the rest of this series as we get lower and lower in budget.
Mm-hmm.
But what's interesting with this film is that, as we mentioned, it's really beautiful, and I believe that this was shot on 35 millimeter,
Mm-hmm.
um, which, if on a $500,000 budget, you realize a lot of the budget probably went to
The film
the film itself.
alone, yeah.
Um, which is, I think, interesting because, I mean, at least to me, and I'd like to hear you speak on this, Mark, that I think that really gives it this communal aspect because you realize that all of the people that are in this film are probably there because they wanted to be. They weren't hired hands. This was probably the real scene
Oh
of
yeah,
people who were just hanging around
definitely.
with this filmmaker and these
Mm-hmm.
models and actors and actresses.
Totally. Yeah, I definitely got that feel when you watch this movie. It's like, okay, these people either they all knew each other or they became quick friends and they all hung out and did these kind of. I mean, not saying they they did drugs or whatever, but I mean, maybe they did. But
Mhm.
you just get that feeling, that communal feel, like you said. Um, so that is a cool aspect of it. You really feel like you're watching part of a scene, like almost like a, I don't know, like a theater group or a,
Yeah,
something like that. Like they're just gonna get together and make a movie. It
yeah,
has that feel to it. Yeah.
yeah. You're kind of let in on a little bit of it. It almost feels like a secret in a weird way
Yeah,
because it's just so specific.
it
It's just
is.
and a lot of the time movies that are this specific don't hold up well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think a lot of the time that is almost because they kind of don't open the door and let you in on it properly. Whereas this one, they just kind of throw you into the whole scene so quickly that you
Mm-hmm.
kind of almost feel like, oh, I could be in this scene. Like
Yeah.
I could be connected to this thing. Um, and what's cool is this movie was actually super influential in ways that aren't obvious,
Hmm.
because it didn't have a huge influence on cinema, at least to my knowledge. I mean, we said maybe a Nick Refn,
Mm-hmm.
or I know Ryan Gosling directed a film that had a big neon wash and Stranger Things and all that. But where the influence really came in my research that I found, and I've seen it, for listeners who don't know, I actually live in Brooklyn. So there are remnants of this scene still around, but the main place that they're still alive is actually in the club scene.
Mm-hmm.
The club scene, particularly in the avant-garde club movements of the '90s and 2000s, and then now you see it a lot in kind of you see it in there's still an avant-garde club scene in New York. In New
Mm-hmm.
York, particularly in queer art, you see a lot of this kind of neon expressionistic, makeup
Yeah.
drenched look, drag.
I was
Um,
reminded of Party Monster, actually. That whole scene in the,
yeah,
like the club scene where there was really over the top and extravagant and all that. Yeah.
yeah,
Um, which was also New York, of course.
yeah. Which I wonder if that's a misinterpretation or if it's exactly what it is, because this movie doesn't seem to totally embrace the scene. It seems to be
Mm.
pointing out that there's a lot of
Shallowness and
shallowness and
vapidness. Yeah.
stuff. Yeah, like there's kind of
Mm-hmm.
something to be wanted still,
Mm-hmm.
that isn't fulfilling to these people. But I think that happens a lot. There are plenty
Mm-hmm.
of movies and songs that come out where the message just gets totally misinterpreted.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely saw this as a critique on the culture.
Hmm.
Even though they may have enjoyed the culture and they may have felt embraced by it, I still see it as somewhat of a critique of it, and or at least examining it in a certain way,
Yeah,
being introspective about it. And that's what I liked about it. It's a very introspective film, which on the surface you wouldn't think. Okay, low budget sci-fi movie where people wear lots of neon makeup and there's drugs and prostitutes, but really it's very it goes deep. Some of the scenes like really resonated with me, particularly. I'm sure we're going to get to the moments that we enjoyed, but the scene where I think you mentioned it actually, with the scene where she's the main character Margaret she's actually applying the makeup as
hmm
she's giving sort of like a monologue almost to the camera, almost to us.
Yeah.
And that scene was really powerful, I thought, and really used the makeup to the greatest effect, I thought.
Yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, there are a lot of those moments where it's just you feel like it should just be a style thing. You feel like it should just be a pretty image to look at, but then you dig in and you just realize how much exactly is going on.
Yeah,
Um,
and yeah, it's still, there's still that youth to it. It's still
mhm.
a youth culture, and you get that when you watch it. Um, like you said, feels like these people knew each other, and they probably did.
Yeah, it feels like
They're
a young movie made by young people,
hmm
um, which is exciting because movies, they are such a prohibitive medium because of the cost. So
yeah.
a lot of the time, traditionally in the history of cinema, every once in a while you'll see a Paul Thomas Anderson
hmm
or hold on one second, actually, sorry, I think
That's okay.
someone's up there.
That's all right.
Yeah, all right. So every once in a while you'll see a Paul Thomas Anderson or I guess a Damien Chazelle or something like that. A director who's in his or her 20s or early 30s who's able to work on a large scope. But most of the time, direct movies made by young directors, and I don't know how old Zuckerman was in this. I can try to figure it out. I can't find his age anywhere. Also, kind of a mysterious dude. Didn't have a particularly big career after this.
Mm-hmm.
But it feels like a movie really made by young people for young people, um, which is I think the thing that is kind of makes it feel immortal. Maybe,
Mm-hmm.
it feels like it hasn't really aged in a nasty way. Is that even though there are some things that are stuck in the moment a little bit, the feeling of being a lost youth
Mm-hmm.
is still there.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have that seedy New York, and I think that is a character as well as the makeup, and then the whole drug scene. Actually, I wanted to ask you, Jeremy, what did you think the film was trying to say, or did say about drugs or drug culture at that time? Do you think it was trying to have a message, or you think it was presenting it just as they saw it?
So for me, I think that the drug side of it, I mean, in a weird way. So I watched another video which is really good. Maybe we can link to it called "What Is Liquid Sky," that kind of explored some of the themes in this movie. Um, and what that was, what that kind of talks about is where this came from, the kind of time and place. But it also talked about how you see a lot of these contemporary, particularly in television, shows like Girls, Broad City, that explore what it's like to be a young person in New York City, but they're exploring kind of a nicer New
Mm-hmm.
York in a pretty literal way.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think even though this film feels very sci-fi and it feels very abstract, at its core, it's really just a film that's doing something similar to what those shows are doing, which is
Mm-hmm.
exploring what it's like to be a young person in New York. And I
Mm-hmm.
think at that time, drug culture was huge.
It was just a part of being
It
there.
was just a part of being there. So I think there was that. That it was just if they didn't make it about
Mm-hmm.
drugs, it wouldn't be honest. But then I think on top of that, the bigger thing it was doing was it was exploring the idea of chasing euphoria. Because
Mm-hmm.
really every single character in this movie, at the core, I think is just trying to find their little slice of happiness
Mm-hmm.
for the moment. They're not really concerned about what it's going to be like down the line. They're not really concerned about what happened yesterday. They're just very in the moment, trying to
Mm-hmm.
get as high on drugs, on life, on money, on anything they can as
Mm-hmm.
possible. So that's for me is where the drugs come in, and I think they were used in a really interesting way.
For sure. Because you see a lot of movies based on the drug scene or different, aspects of it. And I thought this film really took a different perspective on it. It almost approached it with like a malaise or apathy,
Mm-hmm.
um, that you don't always see on display in these types of of drugs films or
Yeah,
anything like that. You usually don't see that aspect of it. Like you felt like you said, it's basically a part of their lives. Like it's just simply how they lived.
yeah,
It's not even a good thing or a bad thing. It's just kind of what it was.
yeah.
And they're always chasing that high, like you said as well. But do they ever actually feel better in the end? I mean, that's probably not, right? So that's what you get from it. And I think that I think a lot of movies try to present that, but I think this movie just did it so well,
Yeah.
and it's hard to put your finger on why that is exactly. I think a lot of it is the performances, And the imagery also. I mean, the shooting up scenes when they would do that.
It's very
Um,
realistic. It's
it's
not.
realistic, but also abstract. They had
Yeah,
the sound
yeah.
design. It was like akin to like an atomic bomb going off.
Hmm.
When they would shoot up or which I found pretty cool. Like
Yeah, it
it's
was
an interesting
interesting.
way to present that for sure.
It kind of
Um,
seemed to explore the feeling of taking the drug rather
yeah.
than just the effect of the drug after
Hmm.
the fact. Like the
And
drug entering the body.
yeah, and the effects in general. I wanted to touch on that just for a moment because I thought the whole it was almost reminiscent of a petri dish or something
Yeah,
mixed with like film burns or acetate or something, like all in the neon colors.
yeah.
Very very cool imagery.
Yeah, and what Mark is referring to, in case, I mean, I hope that anyone has seen this, but if they haven't, there are certain moments like when some of the characters are taking drugs or having sex, or you're kind
Hmm.
of basically anytime they're doing the thing
Any kind of
that
euphoric.
euphoric, which you know how actually, well, let me finish. So basically, what happens is there's this weird color wash where basically the image becomes a pure abstraction,
Yeah.
um, just soaked in color. How I actually interpreted that, and when I started thinking about it, is that's how the aliens see
Hmm.
because that color effect only came on right before the aliens
Yeah.
were like when they were when heroin was out or when
Hmm.
that euphoric thing was happening that the aliens would want to
Okay.
take.
I got
So
that same feeling.
yeah,
That's cool. Yeah.
yeah, that's kind of a point of view. Um,
Hmm.
but going back to another point you made that it feels so different than other movies about drugs. To me, this movie actually feels. I mean, I don't have a lot of experience with drugs personally, but from talking to people I know in my life who have or anything like that, this movie actually feels much more accurate
Hmm.
to the experience of being an addict than a lot of the really, really heavy movies about drug use. And the reason for that is that it's not connecting any dots because people who are deep in an addiction generally aren't thinking back, oh, why am I in so much pain? You know, why am I
Hmm.
struggling? Why do I feel the need to do this? They're just kind of doing the thing.
Hmm.
It becomes casual. It just becomes the thing they need to do without any real outside circumstances or ideas informing that.
Hmm.
Um, and even with sex, I think there's a certain amount of like sex addiction in this movie as well that it explores, and it's just
Yeah.
kind of this like animal thing where people, they just need the high because maybe
Hmm.
they're unhappy or maybe just because they just want to be a little happier,
Hmm.
and it's just this constant thing, and I think that's kind of what was so dark and interesting, but also contextually what's really interesting, knowing what happened in the world with the AIDS epidemic right after this time.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah. It's very interesting. It's a different take on it. It's like you said. It's you know like some movies that try to tackle this and they do like these almost like these exposés of like exploitative showing all kinds of different. It's almost like this movie is more abstract and that makes it more real in a
Yeah.
weird way, like because you're almost you feel like an alien watching this almost, these
Hmm.
things happening, and you think of it like what are these people doing to themselves, apparently Liquid Sky makes you dance a lot because a lot of the characters would just break out in like spastic dancing, which I thought was pretty
Yeah.
interesting, like different, like it just, like again, it just has that youthful feel to
Yeah.
it. It just has that like energy to it.
Yeah. And even like the dialogue is kind of delivered in a weird way a lot of the time, but
Hmm.
somehow it feels more accurate to how people actually talk. Kind of the small talk and bullshit. Like the rhythms
Hmm.
aren't necessarily how people actually talk, but what they're talking about
Hmm.
somehow seems more real than a lot of movies
And a lot of
get it.
a lot of things they said have like double meanings as well, which I actually wrote down this very short exchange between Jimmy and his mother.
Hmm.
When they were sitting at the kitchen table, she says, "Can I give you a lift uptown?" And he replies, "No, I'm going down."
Yeah.
And just that was like, wow, like I don't
Yeah.
know, just like wow, that just
Well, and
says it all right
contextually
there.
too, in
Yeah.
for those of you who aren't really familiar with New York City, basically there's this street called Houston Street in New York City, which is now where a lot of the fashion is. But back in the '80s, kind of south of Houston, it's called Soho, was where a lot of the art scene was. But it was also now it's kind of like Disneyland. But back
Hmm.
then, it
Yeah.
was a really dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
area. It was mostly young artists and people who you wouldn't necessarily want to come in contact with late at night. Lots of drugs, prostitution, all that. So him saying I'm going downtown contextually too, and saying that to his mother is basically declaring I'm going to get into no good,
Mm-hmm.
and just saying that straight up.
And even just saying I'm going down,
I'm
like
going down. Yeah,
what does that mean? I'm going
I'm
down.
going
Like
down. Yeah.
so, yeah,
Yeah,
just
and there's a lot of really beautiful dialogue in this. It really is like it's sharp, it's witty.
it almost like hits you. Like you almost feel like after you've seen so many films, you kind of feel like you've seen it all or heard it all. Like, but there were moments in this film where the character would say something and actually just like made me take a moment and think about it. And it just not every movie does that. So I think even just from that aspect, it's worth looking at. And one other aspect I wanted to touch on just briefly here, the editing. We don't, editing doesn't always get the credit it deserves.
Hmm.
I thought many scenes had a juxtaposition to it that I thought was really cool,
Hmm.
between the images and what was going on. Like one example is cutting back and forth between photos of Margaret and her traditional coming of age, growing up in a small town
Hmm.
in Connecticut, and then cutting that or weaving within that her currently snorting cocaine.
Hmm.
So just things like that. They did that a lot in the film, and it's very powerful
Yeah.
when you combine those different types of images. So was that something that you took notice to as well?
Yeah, well, you know what? It's not something I really thought about a lot during the film, but now that you're bringing it up, there are some moments that are kind of coming to mind where now that do seem kind of unconventional and really surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Like there was one scene where there were like three conversations going on all at once.
Right. Right.
And rather than going from one conversation, then cutting to another scene, finishing that conversation, they were cutting these conversations together, but they were shot in such a way where it was like, shot reverse shot, and it looked like one person was having a conversation with someone else, but then you realize that they're cutting multiple scenes together, and it became a little confusing.
Mm-hmm.
In a good way, because it was like this young woman moving throughout the world, having these conversations, not really absorbing
Mm-hmm.
any of them, just kind of bouncing from
Feeling
conversation,
confused.
feeling confused.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, obviously the more severe edits where it was like, these color bleeds. One thing I thought was cool was kind of the interaction with the camera too. I felt like a lot of the time there was almost a conscious, even if they weren't looking right down the barrel of the camera, it
Mm-hmm.
felt like these actors and actresses and these characters were almost kind of posing or voguing for the camera. That like
Like a fashion shoot.
yeah, like the whole thing was kind of this fashion shoot, and they were always trying to get their little bit of pleasure, their little bit of screen time, which may
Mm-hmm.
have been a result of actually having untrained actors who were just trying to get their screen time
Mm-hmm.
and were kind of vain, but that's kind of perfectly fitting.
Yeah.
Um, Another thing that I thought was really interesting was the way that photography was used throughout this film.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the fact that the girl is a model, and what photography does is it captures a moment kind of out of context for the rest of time, and that's kind of what she's struggling with, is feeling like she is kind of out of time, stuck in a moment, not really sure what's going to happen before or after, but just trying to look good and
Mm-hmm.
feel good, which is kind of what they're all doing.
Mm-hmm.
um, and what's interesting to me too, um, kind of off of that, is that because she's a model, she's constantly being dressed up and made up, and the fact that this is an alien film, and that when you look at it, we have the context of the scene, but realistically, if you were to see any of these people walking down the street, they would look alien to us.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost like she is the alien in a weird
Mm.
way, outside of her own
Yeah.
comfort zone. I mean,
Yeah.
Connecticut compared to Soho in 1982 is
The punk
basically
new
like
wave
going
scene
to
too. Yeah.
another planet, anyways.
Right.
Um,
Right. I didn't even think about that, but that makes total sense for sure. Yeah. That's. See, there's levels upon levels in this film.
yeah, no, it's a really definitely worth exploring. I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
so many interesting moments.
Definitely. Yeah. This is definitely a recommended one from us. Um, and one last thing I wanted to touch on real quick. The dual role, the performances, with I just forgot her name.
Carlisle and Carlisle.
Yeah, yeah. The dual role played by Anne Carlisle, with the main characters of Margaret and Jimmy. How do you think that worked? Do you think that added an interesting aspect to the film?
Yeah, well, honestly, I didn't even realize it was the same person
Mm.
playing them until after, because so many of the characters look so androgynous
Yeah.
that I didn't even question it. I just kind of
Mm.
said, "Oh,
Like,
it's
oh,
a
they could.
it's a man who kind of looks feminine and a woman who kind of looks masculine," and
Mm-hmm.
which I think is maybe the point of having the
It
same actress.
probably intentional. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because it makes you realize that if everyone, I mean, the idea of androgyny in a scene that's all about individualism is
Mm.
kind of an interesting juxtaposition, because if everyone is trying to look the same but be different, those two things are kind of at odds with each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's almost like they're trying to say it doesn't matter what we look like, but really it does.
Hmm.
To other people and in the world, and that's what they're kind of rebelling against. I would say in this, one of the things they're rebelling against.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's interesting too is, this young woman does want, I think, a sense of being an individual. She doesn't feel like she's on her own, and I think that when she finds out that, as she said, I won't say the actual word, but she says, "They call me beautiful, and I kill with my C word. Isn't it fashionable?"
Mm-hmm.
It's like she has that ability. She finds out about her ability to kill people through having sex, and her first thought is, "I'm an original. It's cool. I'm in vogue. It's interesting. It's different." Um, it's kind of interesting because she's trying to separate herself, and then when she finds out that it's not her, and in fact is something outside of her, it's really disappointing to the point where she wants to off herself, basically.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think that theme also of kind of breaking from the herd uh, is really prevalent. A lot of stuff going on here.
Yeah. This movie does has some beautiful vulgarities in it. I'll
Yeah,
say that.
yeah,
Again, it kind of just takes you by surprise almost, where you're just like, did she really say that? Wow,
yeah.
that's
Not
great.
one, not one to watch with your
Um,
mother-in-law.
no, probably not the best one.
Probably not.
Yeah.
Um, but definitely one to watch, and one to watch multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
I would say I'm definitely going to go revisit this. Mark, any
Uh,
final thoughts, images?
well, I would say from my personal view, yeah, I mean, definitely watch it more than once because I kind of wrote this movie off. The first time I saw it, like I said, kind of washed over me. Maybe I was expecting something different, so I just didn't maybe take it in as much. But seeing it the second time and really paying attention to it, I really got a lot from it. So that's and also the moments that one scene I brought up about her putting the makeup on while she's basically looking at the camera and giving that monologue. Also, the scene of the montage or the cutting back and forth between the photos of her growing up and her doing drugs currently and all that. I thought those two parts were probably the ones that stuck out the most to me, and then just the visuals, the effects, the
Mhm.
pixelated, discolored imagery that you see throughout. That just almost sears into your brain. When you think of this movie, it's like that just really sticks with you.
Mhm.
So how about for you?
Yeah, I mean, the big one for me, I mean, a lot of things, you can probably hear the enthusiasm in my voice. I'm super excited about this movie. I also plan on stealing from it in my own work a lot at this
As
point.
you should, as you
As
should.
you should, as all of you, any of you are filmmakers listening, steal and
Yeah,
steal often.
we all
Um,
steal, so steal from the best.
yeah,
Yeah.
steal from the best. But yeah, particularly the makeup, and then particularly the scene you're referring to as well, which is in Carlisle's big monologue. Um, while she's putting makeup on, is just such a beautiful, beautiful, poignant moment.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Particularly in today's world too.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think so many of the things that this movie explores just hold up. And if you were to just swap out, you know, 80s Soho for 2018 Williamsburg and put people in hipster clothing,
Yeah.
it would all work exactly the same and work just as well.
Just
Um,
as resonant. Yeah, and it seems like that scene is so fascinating to me because it's almost like the scene where she's putting the makeup on. It's almost like they know that the makeup is iconic in this movie. It's
yeah,
almost like they know like this is what the movie is, and it's like they just give it to you in that scene, and it's like everything that you would want it to be.
yeah.
Um, because the makeup, once again, I'll say it again, it's just another character. It's like it's such a huge part of this movie.
Which is cool because it's an element of cinema that normally kind of gets
Yeah,
pushed under the rug.
gets
It's
glossed
just,
over for
we're gonna
sure.
make the character look the way they're supposed to, but in this one, it's, the character is going to almost be just drowned in makeup,
Yeah,
and you're gonna notice it, and you're gonna
it's
think about what it means.
It's in your face.
It's in your face. It's in your face and on
Literally
theirs.
on their face. Yeah.
It's on their face.
Yeah, definitely. And then the you have the androgyny, like you said, and the dual roles. So it's almost like the lack of makeup, for the male character she plays is another character. It's like another aspect of the makeup. So yeah, I mean, all around it's so much to dive into with this movie. So much to talk about. We've probably only brushed the surface, but that's probably going to do it for this episode. So we're going to keep going with the series. We're going to keep going down in our budget. We're going to get lower and lower, and we're going to discuss these films and what makes them so interesting and what they do with the little money that they do have. This has been the second part of our series, Lo-Fi Sci-Fi. Thank you for listening, and you can find us on iTunes and Podbean, as well as on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.